Afternoon from Rio de Janeiro. My name is Mariana Cavalcante. I'm a professor of the Sociology Department at the State University of Rio de Janeiro's Institute for Social and Political Studies. I'm one of the conveners of this global lecture series entitled Making Sense of the Post-COVID World. And in the name of my colleagues Sergio Costa, José Maurício Domingues, and Wolfgang Noble, all of them in Germany while I'm here in Rio, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today, Robert Boyer. He will be shortly introduced by Professor Costa, and I will take the questions and guide the debate afterwards. So I'd like to really welcome Professor Boyer. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And I'm personally very much looking forward to listening to you this afternoon. So without further ado, please, Sergio Costa, will you make the introductions?
Actually, Maurício Domingues will do.
Maurício? Okay, I'm sorry. To the global audience, we had some sound trouble. So Professor Domingues, who was originally supposed to introduce Professor Boyer, will do so right now. Sorry, Maurício. Sorry, Sergio, and thank you very much.
Mauricio, we can't hear you.
Mauricio?
We can't hear you.
With Professor Boyer, we still don't hear you. No, sorry, Sergio, take over.
So Sergio will take over? Professor Costa then?
Yes. So it's our pleasure to introduce you to our guest of today, Robert Boyer, who is an economist and associate researcher at the Institute of the Americas. And he has been also fellow and also professor at different institutes, just to mention some positions in Germany in a very known institutes, such as fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, and also fellow in Berlin at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, but also fellow at FU Berlin in our former project, Desigualdades. So Robert Boyer has extensively researched and published in the field of political economy, especially in regulation theory. We can say that Robert Boyer is one of the leading scholars in the field of regulation theory, and is also dedicated to different regions of the world, especially Asian and Latin America. And of course, his main interest is to understand the capital accumulation and capitalist dynamics in these countries. So Robert Boyer has published really an impressive list of books, articles. Due to these technical difficulties we have faced, I will not mention the main publications, but I ask you to check his website. There you find the list of publications. And I just mentioned our last book also concerning the impact of Corona in the global economy, first published in French. I don't know if you're expecting a publication also in English, Robert, but please welcome. Thank you again for joining us for this lecture. The floor is yours.
You have to unmute yourself. Robert Boyer, you have to unmute yourself.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So it is my pleasure to be along with you. And I would like to share my most recent analysis. So the title is a little bit ambitious, a spectral analysis of the global economy, the legacy of COVID-19. What is very interesting in my point of view is that regulation theory was originating, understanding the crisis of American Fordism at the early beginning of the 70s of the last century. And therefore, what is important for regulation theory, it is a theory that interprets not only growth regime, but also crisis. And the core concept is historical junctures, not at all equilibrium. So we will see in this two-day presentation that we do not have at all any equilibrium at the world level. You have, on the contrary, very sophisticated processes combining themselves into a very difficult evolution to understand. And what I would like to apply today is the knowledge we gathered on 29 crises, the end of Fordism, the new economy, internet bubble in the 2000s, the large financial recession of the year 2008, and of course, the euro crisis was been very important, and now the COVID, and I will mention incidentally the current war in Europe, in Ukraine. And what is very important for me is that we could thus try to analyze the relation between health, economy, and institutional change. My bet is that these last 2 years will belong to the book of history as turning point, clearly compared with very soft period. The menu is the following. First, contemporary scholars had forgotten that pandemics are very current since the beginning of humanity, and we can learn something out of it. Second element, economists have developed a theory in which, due to the hypothesis of rational expectation and steady growth, you had only risk, but not radical uncertainty. And what is very interesting with COVID-19 or the current state of war, you have radical uncertainty. And this is very difficult. You need totally different instruments studying the processes. Third, economists do like to have optimum. What I would like to show to you is that it is impossible to have optimized during the COVID crisis health, economic prosperity, and public liberty, which explain why the national trajectory are so different. Then I will give my own interpretation about the following statement. State is back. But for my Keynesian and neo-Keynesian friends, Keynes is back. I think it is a total mistake. It's very different stake is at it coming back. Clearly, it is the insurer of last resort of systemic risk and the coordinator of scattered strategies destroyed by radical uncertainty. So the state is back, but it is a totally new state, very different from the opposition between left and right-wing economic policy. The most impressive things for me that, as you know, I'm a fan of Thomas Piketty's famous book on inequality, but he was only considering income and wealth inequality. The striking factor with the COVID is that you discover health inequality, and it is very important, and you discover international inequality due to the diverse investment or medicines in order to fight the same pandemic. The sixth point is, for me, the most surprising. For me, the major event of the COVID-19 is, of course, the progress of medicines, of vaccine, but this is the strengthening of GAFAM, which is to say, transnational capitalism, and symmetrically, if you go to China, a kind of state-led capitalism, a very dynamic form. Last, I will conclude on this. My favorite prognose for what will be the development model for this century, it is not the digitalization. It might be a little bit ecology, but it might be more intensively a model centered upon health, education, and culture. And I will try to argue on all these points. So here is the menu. I will go and display some proof. The first element of the crisis is that you should look back at past pandemic. If you look to this figure, to this table, sorry, you see that you have, since the 14th century, a succession of pandemia with a very different casualty. For example, the most severe one was, of course, the Spanish flu during the First World War. So what is very important for an economic historian, pandemia are not an exception. They are the normal way of functioning of humanity, given the mobility of humans. The second teaching is, I was very surprised when reading some books and articles about how the people dealt with past pandemia, and I found a structural complementarity of 4 actors. First, the medical staff, for them, it is a challenge to improve the knowledge of the profession. But then they propose, for example, lockdown municipality in order to stop the mobility of the virus. But the mayor, the alcalde, the mayor of the city want to defend economic prosperity. So you have a fight between medical advice and economic advice. You have similarly the merchant are complaining about the restriction to economic activity, whereas political power has to trade off between health concern and economic concern. And you have even religion, say people think that God has been sending to humanity this evil in order to discipline them and to teach them how to behave according to. And I was very surprised. I will not detail the example, but the very specific configuration of the present polarization is not new. You have xenophobia, uncertainty of political power, fight between economic prosperity and medical advance. This is not new. Second major result, and I was very surprised, it is econometric colleagues have been doing this study, piling up all the past pandemia, you do realize that the impact lasts for 40 years. And this impact is very different from some countries. France and Italy suffered a lot about the pandemia, whereas Germany and UK muddle through far better. So the third result, which is very important, I will detail it. You have a pandemic, by definition, it is a global, but the domestic reaction is very different, and the economic response tend to be divergent. And this is a very interesting thing. We discover that the world is global, but nation state matter in order to fight against pandemics. Second big result, sorry, I'm an economist, nobody's perfect, but all economic theory is built upon the ability to have law governing the distribution of risk. But look at the case when the first, in March 2020, the virus emerged. You have uncertainty about the mechanism of transmission, uncertainty about the symptom, uncertainty about the strategy to be used. So the big task of politicians was the following. I have to decide today very difficult decisions, for example, to stop economic activity, whereas I don't know what will be the consequence of my decision, because I will only know them when the pandemic will be over and we have learned how to fight against it. So you can understand the anxiety and the fear of the policymaker, because they have to decide with very few elements governing their choice. And here is a model, and this diagram shows the conventional response is, let us open a financial market. In this case, imagine you have a treasury bond and you have many traders, and if they are isolated, you have the famous Gauss curve of the distribution of the value around the central value, which is zero because this bond has an interest rate zero. But imagine that trader realize that their estimate of the impact of the value of the bond is inferior to the estimate of the market. So we will adapt their own estimate with the estimate of the market. As you observe, the dispersion is increasing of the law. But what is very interesting, if I am so upset that I adapt the vision of the market, so I totally forgot my own estimation of the market, I only follow the market. What is very impressive, the market goes from a very bad valuation of the title or a overestimation. And the more I am mimetic, the more I'm imitating the other one, the more I go from excessive pessimism to naive optimism. And what is very interesting, all over the crisis, I was very surprised when you follow until now, you have the fight, and when you follow stock markets, good news from the health front, for example, we find a vaccine, but and second news, the government will support the lockdown of private firms who are prevented from producing. And what is very impressive, you have been observing ups and downs of the market as a normal reaction to uncertainty. And this was very difficult to manage because by definition, financial markets were unable to diagnose what should be the future. And this is very important because it is taking, making a very severe critique to rational expectation analysis, in the sense financial market cannot diagnose the future in face of uncertainty. And I will mention in the next session, then the state has to intervene because the state is the only actor able to stabilize the expectation of the people and try to overcome the radical uncertainty. Let me now introduce it was very difficult for governments to be popular because whatever the decision we take, they have very strong opponents. At the early beginning, given the high mortality rate, apparently, of the virus, clearly most of the government decided to lock down the economy. But after a while, they realized that then the costs of economic losses were very important. And clearly, at the end of the day, they had to face how to trade off between minimizing the death rate or minimizing the decline of the GDP. And it was a very difficult, and you have been some governments, for example, in US and UK, preferring keeping open the economy, some other countries like China or Taiwan stopping the economy in order to stop the virus. So you had the first contradiction. But what was very interesting in the taxonomy of the reaction is that it was impossible to preserve free public goods. First, citizen freedom, preserving health of the population, preserving economic production capacity. Imagine I'm in China, given the few respect for human private rights, it was easy to lock down the economy and to preserve the death rate was very low, and you minimize the economic losses. But imagine in the contrary, in the US, where by definition, the human freedom is crucial and prosperity is the cement of US society. Therefore, you will not have any coercive measure, and so on. So clearly, what is very interesting for this case, political elites had to make choices, and they have been very different across country. And one of the leading theme of my presentation is that you have a global challenge, and de facto, it is revealing how different our structure the society at the world level. Third change, it is what I call hierarchy of temporality. Before 2020, the timing was set by financial markets. Every nanosecond, you had quotation of derivatives, stock market, treasury bond. Firms had to adapt, and wage labor and state spending had to adapt. In a sense, the idea of the healthcare system was to be as quick as the quotation of financial market. Of course, it was impossible. When the virus surges, then you realize that the core concern of government is to produce the medical goods and services in order to fight the pandemics. And therefore, you soften competition law, you accept public deficit just to be sure that you can have the means to fight against the virus. In the sense, the time of the virus is sequencing all the decision of the rest of the, and this is total inversion of temporality. In this sense, it is an historical, remember, 2/3 of humanity have been locked down, inversing totally the priority of the past periods about the economic prosperity. Fourth result, as you have various variants of the virus, as you progressively learn how to trade off, in the vertical axis, you have the losses of GDP, and in horizontal axis, the number of dead people per total population. As you get used, you learn how to compatibilize fighting the disease and limiting the decline in economic activity. So again, when you have uncertainty, you only know ex post what would have been the best strategy. And this is a very interesting, in a sense, history matter. Here is maybe one of the central points, the fourth point of my presentation. You have an implicit return to the state. Why? Because it is the central actor in coordinating expectation, strategy, behavior, and in expressing national solidarity. Let me develop this idea. First element, you remember the financial market were unable to diagnose what could be the future. Nobody were. If you delegate to the state the task to decide to lock down or not to lock down the economy, in a sense, you reduce a part of the radical uncertainty. So clearly the state come back because every economic actor, firms, consumers, banks, financiers, have to look at a focal point, and this focal point is set by state by definition. So everybody is looking, what does the state advise to do? And this is very important. We rediscover the centrality of the state as coordinating mechanism. Second element, you synchronize private expectation. Everybody, any individual had know the available information. By gathering information from epidemiologists, from medical experts, from epidemiologists, from macroeconomist modeler, from mobile phone mobility activity, and so on, the state could socialize private expectation. So, and in a sense, it was a replacement of the famous and false hypothesis of rational exploitation. Third role, it has been, you have a systemic risk. Nobody is to blame for, a priori. Therefore, you need a private insurance cannot cover the risk of such a pandemic. So the state will guarantee, for example, that nobody will be dying from lack of food by giving some money support in order to sustain the economic welfare of the population, whatever the ideological orientation of the. Let me give an example. President Trump was a free marketer, was in favor of prosperity, has been most generous than social democratic government, just to send checks to the American families, just to be sure of the credibility and the support of public opinion. So clearly it was an insurer, whatever the ideology, state of market. Last but not least, you have a new partnership between public and private. Startups in biomedicine discovered vaccines, and public funding has been diffusing them. So in essence, you have a new relation in which states and private initiatives are cooperating in a new form of cooperation, totally opposed to the duality, either private or public. Last but not least, a kind of blurring out of ideological boundaries, in the sense, for example, President Macron was to be supposed a neo-Schumpeterian, has been acting as a social democratic president, whatever his initial project for France was. And this is changed, and observe, this is not at all Keynesianism. The spending of public, the increase of public spending is not the core. The core are all the 5 functions I've been mentioning. And of course, some of my friends say it is the end of the ideology of free market, in the sense, because clearly we recognize the state is absolutely necessary, and the pandemic, the mix has been made very clear. Let me address the question of inequality. I will go very quickly because time is elapsing. I will only present the data. What is very impressive for me, I'm blocked. Okay, it is, for example, you remember that, it is in Spanish, okay. Traditionally, the study on inequality do stress the role of education and job. So people with high education get good jobs, get good housing, and so everything is up. But what has been discovered is that the access to care, to vaccine, has been very unequal within the same society and across society. So we find out that the discrepancy in mortality rates by social classes has been huge, especially, for example, in the United States or in Latin America, which is adding a new form of inequality, which was totally neglected, the access to a good healthcare system. And on this part, of course, you have clear opposition between social democratic government and, of course, free marketers. Second surprise, observe this element, in Taiwan, due to early warning and a very good organization for detecting pandemics and fighting it, you have a cumulated mortality rate very low. You go to poor Brazil, you are, due to very clumsy management of the pandemic, as well as in US, two populist government, you had a huge discrepancy. Observe in Cuba, you have only 80 for 100,000 population. In Brazil, it is nearly 3,000 per 100,000 population. So you see the huge discrepancy of the national way of handling the pandemic. Result, an equivalent result is observed. Where does the research on the virus, COVID, COVID-19 is taking place. Observe, it is mainly in the north. Observe, with the exception of Brazil, very few research in America, scattered research in Africa, and mainly North America, Europe, and Asia being the core, and a total discrepancy in the ability to innovate in order to respond to it. This is a new form of dependency not only on foreign capital, but also on knowledge about the new pandemic. What about vaccination? Clearly, you remember that it was supposed to be monitored by World Health Organization, but by the fact that the funding was very limited, and you had health protectionism, de facto observed the huge discrepancy between the vaccination rate across countries, an incredible variation of inequality, which explains also why the mortality has been highly differentiated between the diverse societies. So, and this was not expected in the good time period. The geopolitics of COVID is very interesting. First, you have a fight between US and China. Where does the virus originate? Then you had governments realize that the production of healthcare goods are highly concentrated either in China or in India, which is it was a shock in the sense that loss of national sovereignty in terms of public health. Third characteristic, government hesitating between sanitary protectionism and scientific cooperation among researchers. I was very amazed. All the scientists have been cooperating with an incredible efficiency, whereas quite all governments have been protectionist. For example, forbidding some drug company to export to the rest of the world. First, clearly, you had competition for vaccine creation. For example, China and Russia has been engaging a race in order to produce a vaccine before, for example, Western world. And what is very interesting, some drug company succeeded, over failed, and it created a new hierarchy in the distribution of biomedical research. Last but not least, it was supplying vaccine was a diplomatic tool both for China and Russia. In a sense, this was much more stronger than the COVAX initiative that trying to buy jointly all the vaccine and redistribute them according to the needs of the various populations. So you imagine the geopolitics has been dramatically transformed by COVID. Sixth result, here in bright color, you have limited funding to fight the pandemic. And in deep green, you have until more than 10% of public deficit related to GDP. And again, observe that again, with the exception of Brazil, all the richer in the north has been able to spend a lot in order to fight the pandemic. Observe poor Africa, unable to, they are very dependent from the world trade, and they have been suffering economic losses incredible. So new source of inequality. Some, for example, like Taiwan, have been very efficient in limiting the decline of GDP, but in other countries, there have been a dramatic decline in GDP. Again, strong differentiation of national trajectory. Last but not least, you had a passionate fight for the United Nations initiative in order to promote Human Development Index. And brutally, with stopping school, with the lack of food, with mortality and so on, you organize a regression, a massive regression of nearly 15 years of progress in the human welfare index at the global level. So clearly, this crisis has been showing the limited solidarity in spite of the United Nations organization. Let me present you my favorite scenario for the next century. Let us go to US, and you remember that my friend Michel Greta began his study of regulation by studying the administration regime in US. For him, it has been coined the concept of 4Ds. In 4Ds, clearly, what was very important, it was manufacturing and industry of consumption goods and investment goods was the leading phenomena observed in the 70s and 80s of the previous century. This was the key element component of the dynamism. Most of my post-Keynesian friends think that since the financial deregulation and globalization, the American accumulation regime is finance-led. And de facto, you observe that 24% of GDP, or nearly 25%, are coming from value added in the finance sector, compared with 11% only for this. But my argument is that if you are adding education, healthcare, and leisure, the first leading sector now in US, a third of the economy, is what I call an anthropo-genetic model, in the sense the spending in education, training, healthcare, and organization of cultural life are the leading sector, not at all the finance-led, nor the aging for this. And this has been suggesting to me the concept of anthropo-genetic model. Imagine you have a very efficient and democratic educative system. You provide the people with ability to be good citizens and good workers and operators for within production. You train them in the sense, since you have an obsolescence of talents and competence, you train them for organizing a lifelong learning. Then you invest in healthcare system. Just if you are longer life expectancy, by definition, the rate of return of your education is larger. Then if you pile it up, education, vocational training, healthcare system, you have precondition on one side, well-being of the population, which is a very important attribute, but you are also active productive population, dynamism of the production of goods, what give the ability to finance by public spending all these public services, and you have a virtuous circle in which the more you invest in education and healthcare and culture, the more you have private returns and economic prosperity. And one good example for me of this model is probably the Scandinavian countries such as Sweden and Denmark. So my core argument is following: this could be the development model of the next century. The big difficulty is that for US, you have a very unequal model, since you have a market-led healthcare system, rich people spend a lot to extend their life expectancy, whereas people die at the door of the hospital because they don't have any private or public insurance. So clearly in this model, the rich get good health and life expectancy. The poor observe that in some fraction of the population, the US, you have a constant decline of life expectancy due to various causes of murdering by guns, but also opioids and so on. But by definition, this model should be an extension of the social democratic capitalism, in the sense, as I mentioned you, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, they are all of them at the forefront of this new model because they belong to the tradition that investing in state public spending helps in promoting economic prosperity. But given the situation, for example, in the case of France, we have the government has to invest fighting against unemployment, guaranteeing health, and fighting against climate change. And you understand that given this pressure, the priority is not at all to the healthcare system. For example, in the present electoral campaign in France, few candidates have been mentioning healthcare. It has been totally forgotten. The only issue has been standard of living and fight against climate change. The healthcare system has been totally forgotten because governments have to trade off between three priorities. And for them, healthcare does not seem to be, which block my feeling, the diffusion in France of my favorite model, the anthropo-genetic model. Let me speed up. Here, I want to share with you one of my surprises. When all the regularity in production have been changing, for example, you realize that global value chains are interrupted by the fact that the mobility, the transport by sea is stopped. Consumption, by definition, people cannot go to the restaurant, to hospital, to holidays, leisure, and so on. So you have a shift of consumption from services to manufacturing goods. Investment, on the time you used to invest in financial assets, now you have to invest in productive, and so on. So what is very impressive, the coronavirus has been shifting all the economic regularity observed. And it is a very interesting phenomenon for example, let me take the example of telework. You had a modest development of work at home. With the pandemics, you have a tripling of the rate. Nearly 40% of people have been working at home. An incredible acceleration of previous trends. Similarly, what is very important, we saw the rise of the power of GAFAM. Let me explain why. And I was, in the early beginning of my diagnosis, I was not aware. I was thinking GAFAM would enter in crisis. Not at all. Why? First, they had invented e-commerce and teleworking in the sense that they could deliver, for example, Amazon could deliver all over the world the goods needed to fight the pandemic. And Zoom had a boom because it can be used in order to continue to work in the service economy without going at work. GAFAM networks have been easing protectionist measures, for example, in the sense, since they have a logistic network all over the world, totally independent from public infrastructure, they were able to organize the free mobility of the goods we were dispatching, in spite of the temptation of protectionist measure by national government. Third advantage of GAFAM, they seem to be the development model of the future, given normal trade will vanish or be restricted, and most of new markets will be digitalized via platform, large platforms operating at the transnational level. Fourth element, at any second, the GAFAM is gathering big data in real time that can be used not only to self-marketing studies, but also to optimize their own strategy, or they can even sell the data to governments in order, for example, to monitor the control of mobility in order to fight against the pandemic. So if you look carefully, the GAFAM have been the hero of the pandemic, in the sense they have been compensating all the locking down by shifting from face-to-face trading to digital transaction. Here is a quasi-final there is no economic integral determinism. I have many neo-Schumpeterian friends. For them, technology is shaping the evolution of capitalism. In this diagram, I've been comparing three trajectories. Here, let us go to US. I call this a commodified society in the sense that everything can be converted into a commodity to be exchanged for a profit. Therefore, you have concentration of wealth. The wage labor nexus is totally dominated by the fact that the labor contract is only a commercial contract. Remember Uber, example, the subordination of wage earner is cancelled. The monetary regime, remember that the GAFAM wanted to invent a purely private digital money. This failed due to the blocking of central bank. And the state was clearly organizing the responding to the need of the GAFAM in order to have the investment in infrastructure. In this sense, we have a very specific model in which clearly the leading actors are the GAFAM, even imposing their will to the political. For example, remember the Trump campaign was financed, was helped partially by the fact that Facebook has been selling sophisticated data in order to help the promotion of one of the presidential candidates. So in a sense, the GAFAM are so strong that the Senate cannot control them, because on the contrary, the Senate is controlled by the GAFAM. Let's go to China. As you remember, you have a panel given to the face recognition, the fact that you have a digital credit index attached to each person. The platform capitalism is used for two purposes. First, control social behavior of citizens. Second, optimize the decision of economic policy. And observe that in this case, the Communist Party has the leading role, and the emerging capitalists are under the control of the Communist Party, which explains the recent decision of Chinese Communist Party in order to control the power of the platform capitalism typical of China. And then you have a third model, the European Union, which has been designing the first international regulation about the individual rights about information and the fight against the monopoly created by the platform capitalism. So in a sense, on one side, domination of transnational capital, domination of the Communist Party. In the ideal of European Union, domination of citizens who want to control the way platform capitalism are using their data. Unfortunately, Europe does not have any GAFAM. I will try to go, and of course, when the crisis arrives, everybody is convinced. In red, you have the quotation of the traditional economy. In black, the recovery of the stock market due to the future in the GAFAM. As you know, you had recently a down adjustment of GAFAM because it was a form of speculative bubble. Last, but I will go very quickly. In this diagram, I can summarize it the following. You have more than 1.5 centuries of effort from a public institution, transnational, in order to monitor big pandemics. But as it is observed, it has taken more than nearly 2 centuries just to obtain the fact that, for example, Health World Organization has been given the right, for example, to fund the COVAX fund for the, in a sense, pandemics is highly and fastly mobile, the building of the institution controlling a global public good, that is to say, health security, is very lagging. It is why you still continue to have national protection. Let me conclude. First, crisis, pandemics, and war. Some major events open new epochs. My feeling is that the succession of financial crisis, the euro crisis, the COVID crisis, and of course the current war in Europe will open a new epoch by inducing major institutional change. Second big result, globalization without governance, a sudden awakening. First, world elite was very proud of the mobility of commodities, financiers, high professional, but they were not aware of the mobility of virus and diseases. You realize that you need to globalize also the fight against pandemic. Second discovery, globalization has been very unequal. It has been creating rich people with good health and poor people ailing from many diseases. So globalization, it is the limit of globalization as such. It is very important turning point. Third result, coming back of the state, insurers of last resort of systemic and vectors of solidarity. You remember that private insurance cannot insure the risk of pandemic. It is the role of the state. And remember, this is a very extensive role to the state. It's not the return of Canadian state. It's not a Schumpeterian. It is the state as a space for national solidarity. And unfortunately, why COVAX failed? Because you don't have a world community able to organize the solidarity at the world level. Fourth conclusion, weak healthcare system were not prepared for pandemics and prevention. I've not been mentioning, but one of the costs of the neoliberal strategy has been to underinvest in healthcare and in education. And when the COVID has been rising, you have a massive lack of doctors, nurses, medicines, and so on. So clearly, again, you have a turning point. The idea that public services are costly and they should be reduced. No, some of them are very crucial to fight, for example, pandemic. The striking paradox for me of the crisis following, an acceleration of past trend, more inequality, nationally and internationally, stronger platform capitalism, and stronger state, in spite of the inertia of the ideology of free markets. Sixth result, the GAFAM are so rich, as you know, they invest in space, they invest in automatic car driving, they invest now in biomedicine, in the sense they are so rich, there are such a large cash flow that they could imagine a convergence between digital capitalism and biomedical advance. We should be a kind of neoliberal variant of my anthropo-genetic model. This is one of my prognosis. But I still defend the idea that if you are living, most of you are young in the audience, my bet, remember it, is that at the mid of this century, it will be the anthropo-genetic model with the leading one in complement with the fight for climate control. Because if you have an extraordinary rise of the temperature of the world, by definition, this anthropo-genetic cannot function. So in a sense, my projection is a kind of anthropo-genetic model in a planet that has been reconciled with the global public good, what is to say, the sustainability of the climate change. I have no time to present the scenario, so I'll conclude. You can find many texts on my website. Thanks for your attention. Sorry for being so long. So the floor is now yours. I will be very happy to hear your question. Sorry for being so long, but as you might have noticed, it is a long and very complex history. So we are living an historical turning point, and you need a lot of sentence to try to understand it. Thanks for your attention. I'm waiting for you many questions.
Thank you, Professor Boyer, for this very inspiring presentation. I'm here now to guide you to any questions that there may be. Do we have any?
There is none for the time being.
Oh, no, there will be. I'm sure my colleagues.
No, I'm disappointed.
Of course there will be. I can get you started just very briefly. I'm very struck on, particularly in the end, on the fine grain, on how you describe in such fine grain the paradoxical nature of the crisis, right? And looking at the world from down here in Brazil, I'm very much concerned with the deepening inequalities that we see, and especially how these inequalities get entwined with uncertainty, right? So given that so what I'd like to know is, in this world where inequalities are getting deeper and where you see such a difference even in what platform capitalism looks like, how can we look at one possible emerging model as something that might converge these different trajectories throughout the world? And I really hope that you are right, because looking at the world from down here, it's really difficult to be optimistic about our future, especially also, and this is something I'd also like you to comment on, because I think you talk about a bit about this more in your book, and it has to do with how the future future imaginations shift right from welfare, in a sense, to the ecology, right, into the environment. So I'd also like to hear how this shift in the way the future gets imagined and constituted can also change the scenarios that you just really zoomed past in the end. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that too. Do any of my colleagues here in the panel, do you want to, Mauricio? Yes, go ahead, Mauricio. I hope that you can make your sound work.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes, and now I did what I should have done before. I'm using my cell phone, so that's the only way. Oh, thank you very much, Professor Boyer. It was really a brilliant presentation. And I had the opportunity, I read your book, I have read many of the books actually, and I have today the opportunity to put a question to you that has to do directly with the pandemic and the post-pandemic situation, but also relates to your former work. And let me to be brief and set. You are one of the main representatives of the relations, right? So you discussed liberal capitalism, and for this capitalism, what would be post-Fordist capitalism? I always was curious how it would be possible to systematize, which I don't see it so strongly as the liberal and the Fordist phases, how we could systematize this post-Fordist sort of capitalism, which you would say is a neoliberal capitalism, but I think it's much more complex than that, as you has just shown us. Financialization is true, but the development of what we call the anthropo-genetic sector of the economy is very strong. Many other things that happen during the study phase of capitalism, or as I like to say, the study phase of modernity. For what you're telling us today, you pointed to the fact that you might be going into what we can call a fourth phase of modernity, post-Fordist. And I think this has to be systematized, theorized, and you proposed us today an approach that can lead us in this direction. So if you could comment this issue of phase, which has a lot to do with my work, I would be very glad and thankful.
Okay, so let me respond to the first set of questions on deepening inequality. Then you have a strong national long-run hysteresis, path dependency. imagine I'm in a social democratic, I've been studying intensively Denmark. So in Denmark, at the end of the 19th century, you had a huge strike opposing business owner to workers. And they fight as crazy. And out of this, they have a global accord, which was the following. Workers accept that capitalists make profit, but capitalists admit that workers have to defend their welfare. On this basis, they have been building all the intervention of social welfare capitalism, in the sense, good education and free education for anybody, free healthcare system, free university system, and so on. Build on this accord. When you have a problem, you try to solve it by negotiating. For example, you had again an incredible loss of competitiveness at the end of the at the mid of the 80s of the previous century. They decided that workers could be fired on the condition that the state is providing them a training in order for them to have a new job. So it was the so-called flex security model. So what is very important, if you have this highly democratic situation, competitive election, the sense of a party trying to capture the vote of the voter, then you can have a social democratic model. And this model is exactly the anthropo-genetic model, in the sense that you have highly competitive Danish firm, but it is the consequence of the fact that the major task of the government is to have the well-being of citizens, and the well-being of citizens allows them to be highly competitive. Let me go to Latin America. Let's take a nightmare for me, a country I know very well, Mexico. In Mexico, the public schools are all full. A third of the population, of young population, does not know how to count, how to speak, how to analyze. So if you have a very unequal system, parties are not representative of population, you have populism. My favorite model of anthropo-genetic model is nearly impossible, because the political force has been engendering a state. For example, you remember the President AMLO has been spending with 2% of GDP in order to fight the pandemic, whereas in other countries like Brazil, that'd be 8 or 10%. So in a sense, you have a political blocking down of a kind of welfare-based capitalism. And in a sense, in the case of Latin America, with the possible exception of my favorite country, Uruguay, a very small country, and in some case, but I'm not so sure about Costa Rica, you don't have the political forces in order to implement this kind of model. So in a sense, what is very sad, you have a new dividend line. Some countries have access to this future model, others are so lagging that it would be a miracle to be able to do so. On the question of Fordism, yes, I think what was very mechanical is what we have been imagining. For example, my friend Benjamin Coriat and myself have been imagining that Toyotism, what is to say, mass production with differentiation, was the follow-up. No, it was only a minor variant for it. The only two models we found are the following. One, finance-led. In the US, all the dynamics I've been working in Economy and Society in January 2000 paper is finance-led, the follower of Fordism. And my answer was yes. So in a sense, paradoxically, it's not an industrialist model, whereas the other alternative model is a competition-led model, typical of China. In China, why China was so successful, in a sense, you have such a competitive pressure that you have a rate of profit and accumulation, which has been creating a new model, which will be competition-led model in the sense. And in between, you have welfare capitalism in Europe. So, and therefore, what is very impressive, and they are complementary in the sense that it is very difficult to Latin America to imitate welfare, and it is impossible for Europe to mimic the Chinese model. So in a sense, globalization has been creating complementarity of models. And if you look at my most recent book, to be translated to English quite soon, Political Economy of Capitalism with an S, you will find that I defend the idea that the regime has become not in competition, but complementary one with another, in the sense that the good welfare capitalism will not be diffusing slowly and normally as the rest of the world. This diffusion process will not take place unless you have dramatic political change, equivalent of the global transformation and later period of Latin America, with the big depression, cutting down for the world market. If you have imagine a complete collapse of the world system, maybe you have a new chance for Latin America to recover a form of another autonomy. So the core of message is we are very naive in thinking that everybody will converge towards for this. No, it was an illusion, it was an error. You have many, many other forms.
Thank you. Wolfgang?
Yes, Professor Boyer, thank you also very much for your talk, which really was quite brilliant, I would say, and I was convinced in many, many respects. I have one beg for a clarification. I mean, you obviously argued that there will be a comeback of the state. Mm-hmm. And I fully agree that that will probably happen. But what I didn't really understand is what you mean by a new state. You said it will not be a kind of Keynesian state. That doesn't happen. But in the topics you described, I would think that many of the characteristics you described, that is the state we already had, for example, before the crisis in Germany. You know, mm-hmm. You are educating the population, there is a kind of ideology production, you are, you know, pushing the population in a particular kind of direction. So from a German perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if I would see a kind of a very, very continuous development of the state. There's not a change. And I would just want to know how you see that. Is it really a new state or is it a continuation of older trends?
Very good question. As you know, you are very Keynesian economists in Germany because you are supposed to be governed by a social market economy, yeah, in which, by definition, ordoliberalism has been creating the institution in order to develop welfare. So in a sense, I will surprise you, from a macroeconomic point of view, analytical point of view, Keynesianism never existed in Germany. So you're totally right. Because in your state, I will make a tribute to Leeds, the theorization of protectionism, because in a sense, is the offer of my anthropo-genetic model. The role of the state should be to monitor the talent which enables the development of production forces. You have exactly the state in Germany. And observe, it's not the Keynesian state. The Keynesian state is deficit spending, you see, clearly. Investment of the state to stabilize, reduction of inequality is totally different. So I like very much your question, because my comparative analysis, you have never been Keynesian. You have been your own model, which comes out of the world. And in the intervention now, it's not, I have a good friend, Bob Jessop. I think we are now a neo-Schumpeterian state. No, Mr. Macron was for a favor of a neo-Schumpeterian state. Now it's for a welfare state. So you understand clearly that you could imagine a neo-Schumpeterian state, a platform for innovation. For example, Ireland is a neo-Schumpeterian state. They attract all the foreign direct investment to be. So this is their core objective, you see. They are not Keynesian. And you see, so my argument, the example was US, but Trump could send an incredible check to all Americans, you see. Clearly, it's the step, you see, you understand, it is much more like Keynesian. It is sustaining political support in face of hardship of the COVID. So it is a kind of a necessary new function of the state, no? For the society not to explode. And you remember, it is much deeper than Keynesianism, because Keynesianism will be high taxation of high incomes. Thomas Piketty, no, he sent a check even into rich. So you understand that it's a totally different form of the state. And I think economic theoreticians are too blocked by interventionists against laissez-faire. No, you have many forms of the state. One extreme is Chinese. You see clearly the Chinese is not Keynesian, it's not Schumpeterian. This clearly an idiosyncratic way in which the economic elite and the political elite have been merging in order to develop an incredible new form of the state. So, and for example, most of the people think that that China will collapse as Soviet Union have been collapsing. The Chinese state has nothing to say with the Soviet state. Clearly, it is a development state, whereas the Soviet state was a kind of rentier of predatory state for military defense. So your question is very good. We should revisit absolutely the role of the state. And it is very diverse. You have very specific compromise in each country. And therefore, it is very difficult to import a model from one country to another, because you should import the compromise. For example, I will give an example. The French elite, since the 70s, since Jacques Delors, who wanted to import the German model in industrial relations. We have been totally half a century after. We have very conflicting social relations. We have been, we passed the law, but they have been not enacted because the business elite do not trust the workers, and the workers conversely. So you see again, so my presentation is against universal models. Be careful. You have the same state, but the state has a huge variety. And it is the contribution of regulation to have been done with it. Be careful on this highly specific from the state. Because if you use bad words incorrectly, then you see, I'm fond of my Keynesian friend, for them, they say, the master Keynes has come back. Not at all. But not at all. It is a complete error, a misunderstanding, incredibly one. So you see how you are blocked by the state is Keynesian saying, no, many other one. So your question is very good. And by the way, my concern about the stability of European Union is that France and Germany are so different models. We are consumption-led, you are export-led. We are complementary, but we never converge to your model. And if you don't admit this complementarity, the European Union can break down, because France will never be the second Germany. Okay. We are unable to do so. We can be the complement. So you understand why it is very important to diagnose the taxonomy of accumulation regime, because then you have a structural analysis. Are they compatible? And if you organize a little bit of solidarity, you could imagine the compatibility between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. But you have to need a basic compromise to admit this kind of solidarity transfer, which is good for the world, but detrimental for, because you organize transitory the transfer from the north to the south. So we understand the interest of the concept of regulation. It helps to understand the structural difficulty for European integration.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
checked. You have question in the question.
Yes, I have some questions, if you allow me, Mariana. Some questions also from the students. They sent questions before, more based on the text they have read on the subject. It's a text by Ravi Kambur, but the so to say the focus is quite similar. In this text, the main thesis that you have also during and after the pandemic a sort of state-led economies. So you have a sort of shift there. And the questions from the students are most of them are connected to this shift. And I will try to summarize because I have a lot of questions, but we'll try to summarize perhaps in 3 main points. The first question is related to the dropping GDP. So if there is really a return of the state, what can the government do to weaken the GDP dropping? So should the actions to weaken dropping GDP be the result of coordinated activities of the whole world of individual countries? So since we are living in a global economy, how can states really work in the sense of weakening this dropping GDP? This is one question related to this shift to a market-led economies. Then a second question is more contemporary. Also, different students ask the same question. If the war in Ukraine has changed this logic of state-centered or state-led responses to crisis, how the war somehow takes influence in this process. And then, if allow me, I have myself a question, and is perhaps an attempt to problematize the idea of the return of the state. It's true that you have a return of the state, but it's quite different in the different countries. I think you mentioned this also in your presentation. But you know, you have states which don't have state capacity for really provide intervention. In that case, you have civil societies and families taking a very important role also in providing assistance to the poor and so on. So where the state is not able to offer this assistance, but also in the countries in the global north, you have also, let's put in these terms, also a return of the family. So since you have digitalization process such as homeschooling and also people working from home, so home office and so on, so that means that the impact, the effect of social policies, of state policies for reducing inequalities, this impact is not present if you have part of the economy and part of some public service such as school provided at home. And these households are quite different in terms of accessibility, in terms also of infrastructure and so on. So that means that the state is less able to intervene, at least in the sense of reducing inequality. So therefore, perhaps you can comment on this. So this return of the state is somehow ambivalent. For certain functions, it's quite important for certain countries, but for other sectors, the state is even less present because of digitalization. So I know this is a big debate, so but let's stop here before the question
becomes thank you very much. On the first question, how to limit GDP? You have to learn from the mistake of European Union when you have the crisis of sovereign debt in Greece. Then the mistake has been austerity for everybody. No, because Germany was in surplus. So surplus country should spend and deficit country should try to adjust. So do not mimic. You have a crisis, everybody is closing the door and protectionist. So first element. Second element, about the question of war. In a sense, we discover what we call the regulatory function of the state, property right, defense, diplomacy. But the big drama is the following. You have declining productivity increases all over in Europe. So now, when Germany decided to spend 100 billion euro for defense, this is good as a short-termism increase in spending, but it might be detrimental to innovation, to training, and so on. So the big difficulty is in a period in which you have to invest for climate change, you have to reduce inequality, then you still have another element. You have to invest in defense, which when the defense is efficient, you spend for defense, but you never make war. So it is very paradoxical. No, to prevent war, you are wasting money not to be invaded. So in my feeling, it's making things more complicated. For example, France will increase also spending, but my concept would be improving schooling or the less privileged people. So it's much more important. So you have a trade-off. And this is, in a sense, state is back, but the two traditional states, okay, as a factor, it should be the promoting the anthropo-genetic model. So I think it will be at the detriment of my favorite model. I enjoy very much your question, because in a paper on a book on critical development theory, I've been writing a book in which you have state, market, and communities. And what is very important, you have the family, you have the municipality, you have the network, you have the workers' cooperative, and so on, which are organizing on a very different level. And what is very impressive in the case of France, for example, since in order to fight against long-term unemployment, state has been very clumsy. They have been delegating to association the role of finding device in order to be efficient. So, but what is very important in my feeling is that it's not so much independent, it is reactive to the lack of cleverness of the state. So because my most recent, can you read French? I can, because my most recent paper is on économie sociale and solidaire.
Yes, I do, I can. Yes.
I developed the idea that why the system is blocked. It represents 10% of GDP in France over decades. It has been never booming. Why? Because by definition, the state and the firm are using as a kind of, I don't know the English term, as a compensatory mechanism for the thing we are unable to do. But it's not an autonomous expression of citizens. So the big drama, they are in dependent position. But you are totally right. Let me give you, I study very much Mexico. Mexico are not state at all. You have no law. No. The state is not, you have the SOCA law, but the state does not exist. The proof is that when a narco is fighting, it is winning the army. So okay, you have not state. But you have networks and family. And why the society is so resilient? Because a huge family, because the numbers is huge, and you organize solidarity within the family. Impressive, no? So the state is out. The market, you have to put, and you organize at this level. So you are totally right. And in some case, you can promote some form. You remember Eleanor Armstrong. You could imagine for managing local resources, it could be a force of production. But this is very rare, in fact, because you remember Rio in Mexico. Mais du coup, votre question est très intéressante. Et alors, dernier point, comment expliquer qu'en Espagne, l'Espagne est traversée, le Portugal, des crises très sévères, la solidarité familiale, à nouveau, les grands-pères, non, à nouveau, l'idée qui est complètement négligée par les théories standards. Et à nouveau, oui, très bien, l'intérêt de la théorie de la régulation.
Vous parlez français maintenant.
It's better to come back to English because not all of us understand French.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm a little tired. Okay. Okay. So the interest of regulation theory is first we observe and when we theorize, no? And if something is important, we put into the theory. Well, my dear friend, you Schumpeterian, have the theory. What I don't see by the theory does not exist. This is a huge error. And they are making incredible error about states. No. Theory has a precise definition, but you have many other ones. And so we call this abduction in the sense of we observe a phenomenon and we try to find the hypothesis that fits to, but we don't derive deductively. No. And this is, in my feeling, one of the good points of regulation theory.
Thank you so much. We still have a couple of questions from students here. Should we go ahead very briefly, or Sergio, anyone else wants to say anything else?
No.
Okay, so the students are just here right now and they sent me in Portuguese. So I have to translate this like off the top of my head.
I can understand Portuguese.
Okay, so Luisa asked if you can talk a little bit more about culture as a pillar that might help us render problematic the organization of time in the capitalist social division of labor. And Danielle has a two-piece question. The first, very similar, because he's asking from the perspective to something that you've already mentioned. He's asking from the perspective of Latin America, what happens to state capacities. They're very reduced in part because of the health crisis. And so the second question that he puts to your model is that innovation and growth connect to modes of extraction that go against the environment, right? On protecting the environment. And so he'd like to know how to overcome these issues in your model. And thank you so much for taking these questions. If you can just answer very briefly, we're really glad that you're here with us.
Okay, so the culture is not Netflix or Disney World or I don't know. Culture is the way you interact at social and political individuals in order to understand each other and try to work out compromise. So remember the example I've been mentioning on Denmark. You find the idea that you have conflicting interests, but we negotiate and then you fight and then you embed this into what is it. So culture is evolving along with capitalism in the way of we have a problem, we frame it, and due to culture, we can try to solve it. It is my vision of culture. And this is very important. In a sense, it is common cognitive maps and expectation in order to overcome contradiction. Any society with capitalism is contradictory. So how to overcome this contradiction? Making revolution if possible, but trying to find out a way to compatible effort. And this is a very important one. And this is why, so in a sense, so it is a kind of Habermasian argument. The only merit of democracy is that it creates the place for anybody to have a voice and then to have the interest expressed. I recommend you to read a wonderful book, Alas in French, by one master, Stefano Palambarini, saying that one part of the Italian crisis has been the eviction of the wage earner from the coalition at the benefit of frontier and industrialists. So clearly, so you have, and I share with my friend Olivier Favreau from Convention School in France, the idea that democracy is good just to find out the culture in order to overcome contradiction. Second question on Latin, yes, I'm amazed. In Mexico, the state does not exist. I'll give a good example. When the Ministry of Security takes an helicopter, the narco fight and the helicopter collapse. Okay, so you see. Okay, okay. And when the narco decided to have war, they won the war. Okay, so and the president has been retreating. So and I give another example. You have on Socalo, you have a TV, and you have a mother of one of the children who have been vanishing, killed nobody. You have a Siqueiros killing her directly on TV. And the guy goes away calmly. You have never any jurisdiction to fight about it. Okay, so imagine the way of recovering fiscality. So it is the state is powerless unless a little bit of clientelism. Okay. So and for example, let me take the example of Greece. Like Greece are no official document telling the property of the land. how can you tax land, which is or housing, if you don't have it? So clearly the state is half the state, okay, not the state. So you understand better, but the absence of capacity. Or go to Lebanon. Lebanon, the state, was the alliance of all the ethnical groups and religious groups, but they were managed non-public good. So the function of the state are vanishing because there is a state in the case of they are pulling the rents, but they are doing nothing for the citizen, and then the economic collapse. So you understand that if you have not agreement to have a strong state, you cannot have any prosperous economy. So you have many examples of non-existing state, and then you see the outcome. But state formation is a very idiosyncratic mechanism. For example, one of the big difficulties of the French-German relation is that our state has been built totally differently from the German one. We have been where the king is imposing the rule to province. In Germany or in Italy, it took time for the regions to ally. So you have a bottom-up approach, top-down and France. The states are very different in Germany and in France, which explains how difficult it is to create new intervention at the wrong level. The big difficulty of climate change is that the very early beginning are very, very annoyed. Why? Because you have to create a public good, which is habitability or sustainability of Earth. But you have to reduce private consumption, energy consumption. So it is a cost in order to create a public good, which is not on the market. Unless you have a tremendous neo-Schumpeterian, you innovate so much that you create a new total industry in order increasing return to scale, which is a fairy tale for kids. This will not, it will cost at the very moment where we have inequality, healthcare system, deterioration of education. So you understand why. Let's go, give you an example in the French. One of the most important French president was Jacques Chirac. He has been declaring the earth is burning and we look away. Strong words. 40 years ago. Since then, we have been doing quasi nothing in France. So you understand, the big drama is that greening is ideology, is rhetorics, not acting, because when acting, you fight against farmers, about car lovers, you fight against all the population. And so I think it will be very difficult to solve this ecological concern by the fact that it's too late. Imagine you take back to the Rio conference and you undertake what was like, we will be totally a different space, but we have been doing quasi nothing. And the Paris conference, clearly quasi not any country is in conformity with what have been declaring. So you create a wonderful agreement, do your best. I cannot do more. So you dear young student, you will have to prepare very hot weather, really. It is with a high probability, because by definition, we want sustainability, but all the compromise goes again. So it is a rhetoric. Clearly, so sorry to be pessimistic. If you read my book, which will be translated in English in Routledge, Political Economy of Capitalism, you have 5 pages in which I argue all the arguments, including the time frame, because we should act today to preserve the health of grandchildren. Imagine this kind of altruism. So I have been gathering all the arguments saying the worst case scenario will happen. And remember, pollution in China, in India without necessary, etc. Poor countries, and so clearly, and it is very amazing the short-termism of. And I was thinking that the pandemics had put at the forefront long-termism, but it has been now in the electoral campaign, it has been totally forgotten. Health does not exist anymore. Incredible, incredible. The next pandemic will be as dramatic as the present one. So be careful. So I do regret it. I don't like it, but politics is as such.
Thank you so much for this and for taking our questions. Does anyone else here have any questions?
I think we are running out of time. Perhaps, I don't know, Mauricio, if you'd like to close the session, since you hadn't the opportunity to start the session. So
just so before he closes it, I just wanted to say that next week we have Nisa Trindade Lima here, who is the president of the Fundação Oswaldo Cruz, which is the largest biomedical research center and vaccine production institute in Latin America. So that should be very exciting. So Mauricio, sorry, please close this for us.
No, I would just like to thank you, because it was really a lecture so encompassing. I think you could picture such a wide range elements of the present situation and depicted three possible scenarios. One of them more optimistic, but according to you, less unlikely, but all the three very well explained to us. I would just add that perhaps we shouldn't desperate about the third scenario, because all this depends on how the political forces that are moving and try to organize themselves now, globally and nationally, all will depend on how they are going to react and the relative weight they're going to happen. Maybe we can expect some tipping points that would push us in the direction of that scenario, although it doesn't seem so likely right now. But you have a bit more optimistic spirit. But anyway, thank you very much for your lecture.
Let me reply immediately. Let me present the last two pages. First dystopia is individualism, commodification, the rich, the good health, biological reductionism of health, and state dependence from financier. And then you have an apocalyptic digital biopolitical panopticon. But if this system will collapse, and then you have dislocation of the international right, scientific failure of biological determinism, disappearance of Homo homini lupus, and then you can see the emergence of a modern welfare state with adequate world institutions, World Health Organization, World Climate Organization with as much power as FME, Office for International Migration being enforced. You have the anthropo-genetic model, which include, of course, the viability of the ecological system, and you have citizens so well trained that you have representative and participatory democracy. So you see, you will have a point of bifurcation, and after this very dramatic episode, you could imagine 2 or 3 decades along ahead, you could imagine this nice scenario of utopia. Imagine, but we will pass by catastrophic points in the sense that a nearly collapse of most of the past world order. But you're right. In the long run, a frequent error is to extrapolate ad infinitum. No, never. By definition, you had globalization during 3 decades, and now you have a new phase of reorganization of interdependence. So I quote a French philosopher: history lasts long. Okay, so be careful. So do not extrapolate. The short term is not the long term. But thank you for all your questions. It was a pleasure to share with you my most recent research.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.